Hello, congregation, family, and friends. I pray that all is well with you today. Right at the top, I have to say Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. Whether you have biological children, whether you're a stepmom, a grandmother, an aunt, all moms, not only today. In my world, every day is Mother's Day. And I just pray that your day and every day going forward is filled with blessings and with joy. Moms, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't been, the human race would have been gone a long time ago, obviously. So moms, I salute you and I honor you today. I want to talk today for a little bit about one of the most godly women of the whole Bible. She's one of my favorite women in the Bible, and her name was Hannah. And we find her in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 1 and chapter 2. Now, if you have a Bible with you, open that to that passage if you'd like, or if you're taking notes. Now, Hannah only appears in two places in all of Scripture. 1 Samuel chapter 1, 1 Samuel chapter 2. That's it. She's nowhere else. So she makes an appearance, but my goodness, what an appearance Hannah makes. Now, what I suggest to you and what I hope that you'll do is this week, please read through all of 1 Samuel chapter 1 and chapter 2 in its entirety. I won't obviously be able to get through two whole chapters here today. There's certain things that I want to point out to you when it comes to Hannah. But I encourage you to read both chapters this week back to back, because you'll get a bigger, more rounded picture of exactly who Hannah was, particularly in her song of praise in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. So if you're there with me, I want to give you a little background, and then I want to show you some attributes that Hannah had, and that all of us really should have, not just godly mothers, but godly fathers as well. We should have these attributes, and then some of the blessings that God gave her as a result of her obedience and as a result of her godly character. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Now the story begins, and I won't go into a whole lot of detail because I don't want it to take away from the main message we're looking at here. But there was a man by the name of Elkanah, and he had two wives. His first wife was named Hannah, and the second wife was named Peninnah, or Peninnah, I guess it's so pronounced. Now, here's what would happen. Peninnah had many children, but Hannah was barren. Hannah was not able to have children. And here's what happened. As a result of that, Peninnah was making fun of Hannah. She was making fun because Hannah was barren. And I just want to read some of these information, the background for you before we get into the actual attributes. As I said, this man named Elkanah had two wives. One was Hannah, the other one was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, and Hannah had no children. That's in verse 2. Now here's what happened in verse 4. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. She had quite a big family. But to Hannah, he would give her a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Please make note that the Lord closed her womb. It was nothing that Hannah did. It was something that God did for a bigger purpose. Verse 6, her rival, however, that would be Peninnah, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. But I want you to see Hannah's reaction in verse 7. It happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, and they went up each year to sacrifice, she would provoke her. That was Peninnah. She would provoke her, so she wept and she would not eat. The first thing I want us to see about Hannah is she was a woman of strength and integrity. While Peninnah was provoking her and making fun of her, you could imagine a woman, especially in that time, a woman who did not bear children was almost an outcast. It was almost the worst thing that could happen to a woman, not having children. And yet, she not only had to deal with that, but all the same time, while Peninnah, year in and year out, is having all of these children, and Hannah doesn't have children, she never once do you see anywhere. You never see her snap back. You never see her call names. You never see retribution. Hannah was a woman of strength and integrity, and that could only come from God. Strength and integrity. Now, here's what happens in verse 8. Elkanah, her husband, says to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? And then he asks her a question. Am I not better to you than 10 sons? You'll notice that Hannah doesn't answer that question. If I was to ask my wife, am I better to you than 10 sons? I'm sure her answer would be, yes, you are. But there's something also about having children. There's something that's inherent inside of every woman who gets that craving, who has that nurturing spirit that they want to have children. Most of the time, God will bless women with children, but sometimes he doesn't. There are women in this world, I know women who are childless for whatever reason, but they don't have children. And so maybe they become surrogate parents, or they become step parents, or they become adoptive parents. There's many ways to become moms and dads other than the normal birth way. But in this case, he's asking her a question. Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Can't you be happy with just me, even if you had 10 sons? Well, she's not going to answer that question, of course. But here's what she did do. In verse 9, it says, Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. That was north of Jerusalem, and that's where they went to have the yearly sacrifices. Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. Now look what Hannah's doing. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord, and she wept bitterly. The second thing I want you to see about Hannah is that she is a woman of prayer. She has a connection with God. She loves God, and she's weeping bitterly. Of course she would be. She's sad because she's barren. She has no children. She's being provoked by this other wife that Elkanah had married. And so she is weeping bitterly, but she's also praying to the Lord. Ladies, you need to have a strong prayer life to be a good mother, to be a godly mother. You need to have a strong prayer life. There are times you need to go to the Lord for wisdom and strength and your integrity, and as particularly those of you who may be single moms who are raising children all by yourself. You need to have a solid prayer life with God. Well, you'll notice here in verse 10 that Hannah had a strong prayer life. That's the second attribute I want you to see. Look what happens in verse 11. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, that's God in heaven, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come in upon her head. Now, look what happens here. Hannah is also a woman of sacrifice. She is saying to God, notice in this very submissive, very humble way, she's calling herself a maidservant. And she's saying, Lord, if you just look upon me with favor, upon your maidservant, and you bless me with a son, then I'm going to give him right back to you. As many years as Hannah had pleaded and probably cried over not having children, she's asking for a son. And what's the first thing she's going to do? If you give me a son, God, I'm going to turn around and give him to the Lord all the days of his life. What is she saying? She is committing him to life in the temple, life away from Hannah. For someone who wanted a child so much, can you imagine that kind of love? Women, moms, that if God asked you to dedicate and give your child to the Lord, would you do it? Especially if it's a child that you would rarely ever see again. We'll see here that Hannah does get to see him, but only once a year. But after he's weaned, and we'll see that after he's weaned, he's gone. He's serving under Eli, and eventually he becomes this great prophet as he's serving God. Could you do that if God said, I want your child, and I want you take your child away from you and to do what I called him to do? Hannah was a woman of sacrifice, great sacrifice. Now, she had no idea at this point whether God was going to grant her petition or not, but she is pleading because she's a woman of prayer, and we see that she's a woman of sacrifice now. Well, look what happens while she's doing this. Verse 12, then it came about as she continued praying. Notice, continued praying. She just wasn't a short prayer here and gone. Hannah was a woman of prayer. She continued praying before the Lord, and Eli, that high priest, was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So guess what? Eli, the high priest, thought she was drunk, it says in verse 13. Have you ever been thinking something in your heart and you're mouthing your words, but you're not being heard? That's what Eli was experiencing. He saw this woman, Hannah, at the temple, moving her lips, but not saying anything. He automatically assumed that she was drunk. She was not drunk. She was praying to the Lord. She was deep in prayer. Verse 14, here's what Eli says to her. How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But we're now about to see yet another attribute of Hannah. She says in verse 15, but Hannah replied, no, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Hannah was a woman of sobriety. She didn't drink wine. She didn't drink strong drink. She wasn't drunk. That was Eli's assumption, and he was dead wrong. And she's saying, I'm simply praying to the Lord. He has the audacity, the nerve to say, put away that wine from you. Stop being drunk. She wasn't drunk. And she says in verse 15, Hannah was a woman of sobriety. She always had her head about her. She didn't get caught up drinking and getting drunk or being impaired in any sort of way. She was praying to the Lord. So another attribute that Hannah had was she was a woman of sobriety. So far we have that Hannah is a woman of strength and integrity. She is a woman of prayer. She is a woman of sacrifice. And now we see that she is a woman of sobriety. Mothers, ladies, if you're watching this and you're planning on having children one day, and I pray that if you want children, that God will grant them to you. But these are some of the attributes and some of the qualities that you want to have as a godly mother, as God is giving you children. There's more though. Look what happens. She says to Eli in verse 16, do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. I'm praying because I'm being provoked. I'm being made fun of. I'm being made to feel bad, and I'm praying and speaking out of this great concern that I have. But she says, do not consider your maidservant a worthless woman or a cheap woman. Hannah was also a woman of virtue. Virtue is very important. She was devoted to her husband, even though he did not give her any children because the Lord had shut up her womb. There's nothing in here in Hannah's story that talks about her leaving, divorcing him, being unhappy. She is devoted and loves her husband and is sticking to her vows. She's a woman of virtue. She's not worthless. She's not cheap. And so there's another attribute with Hannah. Now look, after Hannah says all of this to Eli, he then turns around in verse 17. He says, then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. She said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. That's the first part of Hannah's story. She gets a blessing from Eli, the high priest. It suddenly says that she's now eating, so her appetite is back, and she's no longer sad. She now goes on, and she was no longer sad. Well, that's the first part of Hannah's story. And we see there 5 clear attributes that every woman of God should have, and every woman that becomes a mother should have these attributes: strength, integrity, prayer, sacrifice, sobriety, and virtue. But now we're going to see, because she's now prayed to God, now we're going to see if God is going to answer her prayers. Let's continue on. Verse 19, then they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. That's where they were living. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Look at that. As a result of all of these attributes, being a woman of prayer, being a woman of sacrifice, the Lord has not forgotten Hannah. God has remembered her. That's something to rejoice about, ladies. If you ever feel down, or God has left you alone, or he's not there anymore, he's not hearing your prayers, God remembered Hannah. That should be an encouragement to all of us. And even fathers I'm preaching to. God doesn't forget about his people. He hears the prayers of his people. So look what happens. Verse 20, and it came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son. Isn't that what she asked for? She gave birth to a son and named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked of him of the Lord. Well, right then and there in verse 20, Hannah got her deepest wish, her deepest desire, her deepest prayer request fulfilled. She became a mother. She became a mother. She gave birth to a son. His name was Samuel. He was the last of the judges, and he was the first of the prophets. He played a pivotal role. Samuel had the distinction, I guess, or the honor of being able to crown the first two kings of Israel, King Saul, who was a bad king, and then King David, who was the greatest king. So Samuel, during this bridge between the time of the judges and the time of the kings, Samuel was right in there, very important person in the history of Israel and in the history of civilization. And so here she has a son. Here Hannah becomes a mother. Let's continue. Then the man Elkanah went up with all of his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. Remember, we saw that earlier. They're leaving Ramah and they're coming down to the temple to do their yearly sacrifice. But look what Hannah says. Hannah says, but Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned, then I will bring him up, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. There's a couple of things I want you to see about this, ladies. First of all, she said that she's not going to bring Samuel up to the temple until he is weaned. Now, weaning time, I know, changes from woman to woman. But back in that time, it was not unheard of for a child to be weaned or to be nursed for 3 years. For 3 years. Can you imagine the bond that Hannah had with her son, Samuel, over those 3 years? They're formative years. They're the beginning of life where a child is taking in all kinds of information. And here she has this bond. But I want you to see at the end of verse 22, she is remembering the prayer she made to God. She said, when he is ready, we will appear before the Lord and he will stay there forever. Hannah was a woman of her word. She didn't go back on it. She didn't say, oh, Lord, now I have a son. Oh, I forget about what I said about dedicating him all the days. I'm going to keep him with me. No, she made sure that he was nursed, that he was weaned, that he was healthy, that he was ready to go. And then she was going to bring him up to the temple and then leave him there. And when her and Elkanah left, she would be leaving her beloved son behind to serve in the temple because she made a promise. She was a woman of promise. Look what Elkanah says in verse 23. Her husband said to her, do whatever seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Now, verse 24, we jump ahead, presumably 3 years. Now, when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a jug of wine, brought him into the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young, presumably around 3 years old. They slaughtered the bull and they brought the boy to Eli. And she said, Eli is still the high priest at this point. She says to him, oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood beside you praying to the Lord. And for this boy right here, this boy Samuel, I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition that I have asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Hannah was, she's a woman of thankfulness. That's what we could say. She is a woman of thankfulness. Look at verse 27. She said, for this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I've asked of him. That's being grateful. That's being thankful. When God grants you the desires of your heart, and Hannah wanted nothing more than to be a mother. And now she is a mother, and she's at a critical stage in her life because there is going to be a separation between Hannah and her son Samuel, and it's going to be for life because she made a vow. She made a promise to God. And let that also be a lesson to all of us. When we promise something to God, when we make a vow to God, we better make sure that we hold on to it. The Bible says it's better not to make a vow than to make a vow and then break it. That's the worst thing to do. Don't promise God something if you're not going to follow through with it. Don't promise to do something. Don't promise to say something or be something and then turn around and say, oh, sorry, God, I was just kidding, or I really wasn't sincere, or I changed my mind. Don't do that. Don't do that. You'll see people in Scripture where they played with God. Don't play with God. You hear me say it all the time. So here, let's get back to Hannah. She's up at the temple. She just introduced Samuel to Eli. She says, I'm the woman that was praying for this baby, and here he is, my baby boy. And now I'm going to dedicate him to the Lord. Just as long as he lives, he will be dedicated to the Lord. So she was a woman of, let's look at this in this next section before we move on. Hannah was a woman who was remembered by God. She was a woman who became a mother. She was a woman of independence. She was a woman who kept her promises, and she was a woman also of thankfulness. All of these blessings came to her. She became a mother. She was remembered by God. She was able to stay with her son for 3 years before, when he was fully weaned, then brought him to the temple. But you think her story ends there, that's the end, because this is what she said. Samuel will be serving the Lord the rest of the days of his life. And when she's leaving Samuel behind. But if you read a little further in the 2nd chapter of 1 Samuel, before Hannah disappears off the scene, because then the book takes over in Samuel's life and Eli, and then it moves on into the kings and so on. So Hannah kind of fades from sight. But don't think just because she's in there for 2 little chapters that she is not important. I think you're starting to see just how important Hannah is. Now here's what she got a chance to do. As I said earlier, I want you to read 1 Samuel 1 and 2 together in their entirety. Her song of thanksgiving goes from verse 1 all the way down to verse 11. And we pick up the story in verse 11 of chapter 2 that says, Then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the boy ministered to the Lord before Levi the priest. There was the separation, the physical separation. Elkanah and Hannah came back to Ramah, and Samuel stayed at the temple serving underneath Eli. But the story's not over yet, because God would allow Hannah several more blessings. Now watch this. We're going to move down to verse 28. Verse 18 of chapter 2. Now Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy wearing a linen ephod. That's what the priest wore. It was a linen robe. Verse 19, and his mother would make him a little robe and bring it to him year after year when she would come up with her husband for offered a yearly sacrifice. Do you see, moms, what a privilege that was? Even though she was separated from Samuel, she was allowed to see him once a year. And what did she do? As all moms would do. She's taking care of her son. Each year, she would make a little robe or a little coat or something and bring it to him each year. You know, as your children grow, we get bigger and bigger. We got to keep replacing clothes every year, don't we? As we get bigger, as we get older. So every year that they went up for a sacrifice, Hannah was able to see her son, Samuel, and give him a new coat or a new cloak or something that she made for herself. That's a blessing from God. He didn't just disappear from her life. Yes, he was serving in the temple. And yes, he had a calling from God. But Hannah wasn't cut off from him completely. She got a chance to see him once a year. Then look what happens in verse 20. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, May the Lord give you children from this woman in place of the one dedicated to the Lord. And they went to their own home. Hannah was a woman who was blessed for her sacrifice of Samuel. And we're going to see that in the next verse. Look at verse 21. The Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew before the Lord. Look what else happened to Hannah. She asked for 1 boy. She asked for 1 child. She wound up getting 6. 6 women, 6 ladies, 6. She had a total of 6 children. She wound up having 4 sons and 2 daughters. She dedicated 1 to the Lord. That was his role. That was Samuel's role. But she still had 5 more children to raise at home. You talk about being blessed. You talk about God pouring out his favor upon you for all the years that she was barren. And then she comes back and she's still taking care of Samuel. Even though she has 5 children to take care of, she's still coming back every year and bringing Samuel something. She hasn't forgotten about the one that she dedicated to the Lord. She's still making sure he has clothes every year. And we don't know how many years it was. It doesn't say that it cut off after 5 years or 10 years. So you can imagine him being a young man and she's still bringing clothes for him while she's also raising 5 other children. Wow. Was Hannah blessed or was Hannah blessed? She wound up having 3 sons, 2 daughters, and Samuel. That's 6 children altogether. Now, I don't know, ladies, how many children you may have, but Hannah, I would consider to be extremely blessed. Not just because the God gave her so many children. Do you see in this brief story of Hannah how favored she was? You know, it's real easy for us to look when things are bleak, when things are dark, when it seems hopeless, when it seems empty. For years, Hannah was praying to God for a son. For years, she watched the other wife of Elkanah, Peninnah, give birth to a child after child after child. Hannah, 0. You'll notice here at this point of the story now that Peninnah is not being talked about anymore. The shift goes to Hannah and Elkanah and their family, because the important person coming through there was Samuel. And as we go through there, when you read chapter 3 and you see the prophetic call of Samuel and he begins serving as God is speaking with him, that's where the focus takes us. But we can't forget about Hannah, who was such a godly mother, who was so dedicated to her son and kept her word. Hannah, maybe a forgotten woman, except when we talk about the great mothers of the Bible. I encourage you to read the 2 chapters and get a full picture of Hannah. I pray that this message has blessed you today. If it has, please feel free to share it. God said in Isaiah 55:11, he said his word does not return void. It reaches all those people it intends it to reach. Did it reach you? Did it help you today? Did you learn something? If so, please feel free to share it with someone else. Also, church family, we call ourselves Bereans. We're not better, we're not smarter than anyone else. We call ourselves Bereans, and it's based on Acts 17, verse 11. The Bereans were a people who searched the scriptures every single day to make sure what they were hearing was the truth. The Apostle Paul was there preaching to them in the city of Berea. And they would still, when Paul was done, they would still check the scriptures to make sure what they were hearing was the truth. I encourage you to do the same thing. You owe it to yourself. Whenever you hear a preacher or a Bible teacher, whether it's me, someone on television, radio, social media somewhere, if you go to a church, if you attend a Bible study, wherever you are and you're hearing the word of God preached or taught, you owe it to yourself to make sure that what you're hearing is the truth. That's why I encourage you to read these 2 chapters for your own, and God will give you some additional insight, points that we couldn't even cover today because it was too much for one message. But I pray that you will do that and that you will learn from Scripture and that you will learn